My daughter, a new mother, gave me a choice: become her baby's unpaid nanny or leave the house we shared. She made the demand believing her name on the deed gave her all the power. What she didn't know was that her father had left behind one final hidden provision in the paperwork. A provision that turned my departure into her downfall. So I left. She thought she was kicking me out. In reality, she was starting the countdown to her own eviction. Before I begin, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to hear my story. If you're comfortable, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Now let me tell you my story. The arrangement, in the beginning, was a balm to my grieving heart. My house on Abernathy Road, a sturdy 4-bedroom brick home nestled in the quiet, leafy enclave of Atlanta's Cascade Heights, had felt cavernously empty after my husband Frank passed. For 45 years, its rooms had been filled with the sound of his booming laugh, the scent of his pipe tobacco, and the steady, reassuring presence of a love that had been the bedrock of my entire adult life. Now there was only silence, a quiet so profound it seemed to have a weight of its own. So when my daughter Danielle and her husband Greg had suggested moving in, I had agreed with a relief that was immediate and sincere. "It just makes sense, Mama," Danielle had argued, her voice a smooth, persuasive melody. "We're bursting at the seams in that little rental, and with the baby coming, we could help you with the house and you could help us save up for a down payment. It's a win-win." And for a time it was. At 68, I was newly retired from a long career as a budget director for Atlanta Public Schools, a job that had suited my meticulous, numbers-oriented mind. I was financially secure with a healthy pension, a solid portfolio of investments Frank and I had carefully built, and this beautiful house paid for in full. I didn't need their help, but I craved their company. The thought of a baby's laughter echoing in these silent halls was a promise of spring after a long, hard winter. So they moved in, filling the guest rooms with their things and the air with a new, vibrant energy. Greg, a real estate agent with a smile as polished as his Italian leather shoes, was charming and deferential. Danielle, my only child, was attentive and loving, her pregnant belly a constant, joyful reminder of the new life about to join our family. The house felt like a home again. When my grandson Jacob was born, my joy was complete. He was a perfect, beautiful child, and I fell in love with him with a fierceness that surprised even me. I was a doting grandmother, happy to rock him to sleep, to change his diapers, to give his exhausted parents a much-needed break. The arrangement was working. The house on Abernathy Road was no longer a monument to a past love, but a cradle for a new one. I was, in those first few months, perfectly content. The shift was so subtle at first I almost didn't notice it. It was a slow, creeping erosion of boundaries, a quiet, methodical redefinition of my role in my own home. It began with the small things. Danielle, who worked in social media marketing, was obsessed with maintaining the online facade of a perfect, effortlessly chic modern mother. Her Instagram feed was a curated fantasy of artisanal baby clothes, serene-looking playdates, and gourmet home-cooked meals. The reality, of course, was far more chaotic, and I was increasingly becoming the invisible stagehand responsible for creating her online illusions. "Mama, could you just watch Jacob for an hour? I have a Zoom call with a potential client," would turn into a 3-hour absence while she went to a yoga class. "Could you possibly throw a load of laundry in for me? I'm just so swamped," soon became the unspoken expectation that I was responsible for all the household laundry. The gourmet meals she posted, with captions about the joy of nourishing my family, were almost always cooked by me, the fruits of my labor artfully arranged on a platter for her to photograph before she even took a bite. My best friend Shirley Wallace saw it long before I was willing to. Shirley, a retired high school principal with a spine of pure, unadulterated steel, had been my confidant for 40 years. We met for lunch every Wednesday, a standing appointment that was the one part of my old life I refused to relinquish. "She's treating you like the hired help, Beverly," Shirley had said one afternoon, her voice a low, warning rumble as she stirred her iced tea. "I see the way she talks to you. There's no please or thank you anymore. It's just orders." "She's a new mother, Shirley," I had argued, the excuse sounding weak even to my own ears. "She's overwhelmed." Shirley had fixed me with a look that could quell a food fight in a high school cafeteria from 50 paces. "Overwhelmed is one thing. Entitled is another. That is your house. Your name is on the deed. Frank left you secure so you could enjoy your retirement, not so you could become your daughter's unpaid nanny, cook, and maid. You're the queen of that castle, Beverly. Don't you ever let her treat you like the help. Her words had stung because I knew they were true. The requests had become expectations, and the expectations were hardening into demands. My own life, my plans for a quiet, independent retirement filled with travel, volunteering, and my own pursuits, were being systematically erased. I had envisioned myself as a doting grandmother, a cherished family elder. But in my daughter's eyes, I was becoming something else entirely. A resource. A convenient, live-in, and most importantly, free solution to the high cost of childcare and domestic labor. The creeping entitlement was a vine slowly but surely wrapping itself around my life, and I was beginning to feel its suffocating grip. The harmony of our arrangement was fading, replaced by a growing, dissonant chord of resentment that I could no longer ignore. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday, a day of dreary, persistent rain that mirrored the growing storm inside my own home. I had been up since dawn with Jacob, who was teething and fussy. I had managed to get him back to sleep just as Danielle and Greg were coming downstairs for the day. Danielle, dressed in expensive athletic wear, breezed into the kitchen, grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge and announced, "I'm heading to a spin class, then I have a brunch with some of the other influencer moms. I should be back around 2. It was not a request. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the casual assumption that I had no plans of my own, that my day was a blank slate for her to write upon. "Actually, Danielle," I said, my voice quiet but firm, "I can't today. I have my book club meeting at 11, and then I have a doctor's appointment this afternoon." She stopped in the doorway, her back stiffening. She turned around slowly, her expression a mixture of disbelief and annoyance, as if I had just informed her that the earth was, in fact, flat. "You have plans?" she asked, the words laced with an incredulous condescension. "Yes," I said, my resolve hardening. "I do." "Well, you'll have to cancel them," she said, her voice taking on a sharp, imperious edge. "This brunch is important. It's a networking opportunity." That's when Greg stepped in, his role not that of a mediator but of an enforcer. He put his arm around Danielle's shoulders, a gesture that was meant to look supportive but felt like a strategic flanking maneuver. "Your mother has a point, honey," he said to Danielle before turning his polished smile on me. "We can't just keep springing things on you, Beverly. We need a more formal arrangement. A schedule. So that we all know what to expect." And so, that evening, they sat me down for what they called a family meeting. It was not a meeting, it was an ambush. They sat across from me at my own dining room table, a united front of youthful arrogance and breathtaking entitlement. Danielle had a color-coded spreadsheet printed out, a document she had clearly spent her afternoon preparing instead of attending her important brunch. "We've been thinking, Mama," she began, her tone the one a manager uses to address a problematic employee. "And we've realized that for this arrangement to work long-term, we need to define your role more clearly." She slid the spreadsheet across the table. It was a detailed hour-by-hour schedule of a 60-hour work week. It listed duties under headings: child care, meal preparation, light housekeeping, and errands. It was a job description. A job description for a full-time live-in nanny and housekeeper. There was no mention of a salary. There was no mention of days off. I stared at the paper, at the cold, clinical lines that quantified the complete and total appropriation of my life. I felt a cold, quiet rage building in my chest, a rage that was all the more powerful for its stillness. I looked up from the spreadsheet and met my daughter's eyes. "You want me to be your nanny," I said, my voice flat, devoid of emotion. "We prefer to think of it as you being a full-time hands-on grandmother," Greg chimed in, his voice smooth as silk. "This is what families do. They support each other." "This isn't support, Greg," I said, my gaze unwavering. "This is exploitation." The word hung in the air, sharp and ugly. Danielle flinched, but her expression hardened. The mask of the loving daughter dropped, and in its place was a cold, hard resolve I had never seen before. She believed she held all the cards. She knew that her father's will had left the house to us jointly as 50-50 owners. In her mind, that deed was a shield. She believed she had as much right to be in this house as I did, that I could not force her to leave. She thought my only options were to submit to her terms or to abandon my own home. "This is the arrangement, Mama," she said, her voice as cold as ice. "This is what works for our family now. We need you to be here for Jacob to take on this role. We need your help." She leaned forward, her eyes locking onto mine, and delivered the final brutal blow. So you have a choice. You can either be the grandmother Jacob needs you to be, the one who is here for him full-time, or you can leave. The choice is yours. The ultimatum, so cruel and so casually delivered, was a declaration of war. She had drawn a line in the sand of my own home, confident that I would never dare to cross it. She had mistaken my love for weakness, my generosity for foolishness. She had no idea that she had just handed me the very weapon I needed to reclaim my life. The silence that followed her ultimatum was a living thing. It filled the dining room, pressing in on us, thick with the weight of unspoken history and a future that was about to be irrevocably changed. Danielle and Greg sat there, a smug, united front, their expressions a mixture of defiance and confident expectation. They believed they had cornered me, that my love for my grandson and my attachment to my home would force me to capitulate. They were waiting for my surrender, for the tears, the arguments, the eventual weary acceptance of my new role. They had miscalculated. They had forgotten who I was. I was not just a grandmother. I was Beverly Jordan, a woman who had managed multi-million-dollar budgets, who had faced down superintendents and union leaders, a woman who understood the fine print. And I was not about to be bullied in my own home. I looked at my daughter, at the beautiful face I had loved since the moment I first held her, and I saw a stranger. I saw a woman so consumed by her own selfish desires that she was willing to weaponize her own child, to hold her own mother hostage. The love in my heart was still there, but it was now overshadowed by a profound, soul-crushing disappointment. The time for gentle correction was over. The time for a hard, painful lesson had arrived. I took a slow, deliberate breath, my gaze never leaving hers. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I met her cold, hard stare with a quiet, unshakable calm that seemed to unnerve her more than any outburst would have. I see, I said, my voice steady, each word carefully chosen, carefully weighed. The quiet finality in my tone made her sit up a little straighter, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face for the first time. I folded my hands on the table, my posture as straight and unyielding as my resolve. You've made your position very clear, Danielle. You've given me a choice. I paused, letting the weight of her own words settle back on her. And I've made my decision. I pushed my chair back from the table, the sound of the wood scraping against the floor a sharp, definitive sound in the silent room. I stood up. Then I will leave, I said. The words, so quiet and so simple, landed in the room with the force of a physical blow. Danielle's jaw dropped. Greg's confident smirk vanished, replaced by a look of utter, slack-jawed disbelief. This was not a part of their plan. They had prepared for arguments, for emotional blackmail, for a negotiated surrender. They had not prepared for a quiet, dignified retreat. They had not prepared for me to call their bluff. You what? Danielle stammered, her voice a squeak. I will leave, I repeated, my voice as calm as before. You have given me an ultimatum. Become your servant or leave my home. I will not be a servant. So I will leave. I turned without another word and walked out of the dining room, leaving them sitting there amidst the ruins of their perfectly planned ambush. I walked up the stairs to my bedroom, my steps measured and even. I did not feel grief. I did not feel anger. I felt a strange, cold clarity, the kind of clarity that comes when a difficult, painful decision has finally been made. I took my largest suitcase from the top of the closet and placed it on my bed. I began to pack, my movements efficient and methodical. I packed my most important documents, a selection of my favorite clothes, the toiletries from my bathroom. I took the framed photo of Frank from my bedside table and carefully wrapped it in a sweater. I was halfway through packing when Danielle appeared in the doorway, her face pale with a mixture of panic and fury. You can't be serious, she said, her voice trembling. You're just going to walk out? On your family? On your grandson? I did not stop packing. You are the one who is walking away from our family, Danielle, I said, my back still to her. You are the one who has turned a relationship of love into a business transaction. I am simply refusing to sign the contract. This is your home, she cried, her voice rising with a note of hysteria. You own half of it. You can't just leave. But there was the foundation of her arrogance. The 50-50 split. The legal fact that she believed made her untouchable. I turned to face her then, my expression unreadable. You are right, I said. It is my home. And you would do well to remember that. I closed the suitcase, the click of the latches a sound of finality. I walked past her out of the bedroom and down the stairs. Greg was standing at the bottom of the staircase, his face a mask of confusion. He looked like a man who had just watched a simple business deal go horribly, inexplicably wrong. I walked to the front door and opened it. I turned back one last time and looked at the two of them standing there in the beautiful, stately home they thought they had just conquered. "Enjoy the house," I said, my voice devoid of any warmth. "I trust you'll be very happy here." And then I walked out, closing the door softly behind me. I did not slam it. This was not a dramatic exit born of passion. It was a strategic retreat. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully evicted the queen from her own castle, leaving them to rule in her stead. They had no idea that by walking out that door I was not surrendering. I was triggering a sequence of events, a brilliant hidden trap laid by a wise and loving husband that would ultimately lead to their own eviction. They had won the battle, but I was about to win the war. The drive to Shirley's house was a blur of streetlights and a quiet, steely resolve. I was not homeless. I was a refugee temporarily displaced by a hostile force, but I was on my way to a friendly shore. Shirley, as I knew she would, opened her door before I even had a chance to ring the bell. She took one look at my face, at the suitcase in my hand, and her expression shifted from concern to a cold, righteous fury. She didn't ask what had happened. He knew. She simply wrapped me in a fierce hug and said, "Come in, Beverly. The war room is open." The next morning I was not sitting in a rocker on my porch. I was sitting in a plush leather chair in a downtown Atlanta high-rise, in the office of my late husband's estate lawyer, a sharp, compassionate man named David Chen. Shirley sat beside me, a silent, formidable ally. I had explained the situation, the ultimatum, my departure. David had listened patiently, his face a mask of professional calm, but I could see the anger simmering in his eyes. When I finished, he swiveled his chair to face his computer. "Frank was a brilliant man, Beverly," he said, his voice full of a deep, quiet respect. "He loved Danielle. But he was not blind. He saw the entitlement, the softness. He always said he wanted to leave his daughter a legacy, not a lottery ticket." He pulled up a series of documents on his large monitor, a complex web of legal trusts and estate plans. "Danielle is correct that she is a 50% owner of the house in joint tenancy. Frank wanted to ensure she would always have a stake in the family home. However," he said, a slow, grim smile spreading across his face, "he also wanted to ensure you would never ever be trapped in it. He wanted to guarantee your freedom, your independence, and your financial security above all else." He pointed to a specific section in a thick trust document, a section highlighted in yellow. "He built in a contingency. A brilliant, ironclad contingency that Danielle has clearly never bothered to read. I call it the buyout clause." He proceeded to explain the beautiful, brutal mechanics of the trap Frank had laid. The clause was designed to be triggered by a single, specific event, one of the joint tenants permanently vacating the property. My act of walking out that door, of packing a suitcase and leaving with no intention of returning, had not been an act of surrender. It had been the turning of a key in a lock. "The clause is explicit," David explained, his voice resonating with a quiet, triumphant satisfaction. "Upon one tenant vacating, the remaining tenant, in this case Danielle, has a 90-day window to purchase the departing tenant's 50% share of the property at its current, professionally appraised fair market value." He let that sink in. Shirley's eyes widened and a slow, wicked grin spread across her face. I felt a wave of love and gratitude for my husband so powerful it almost took my breath away. Even from the grave he was protecting me. "Danielle and Greg don't have that kind of money," I said, the statement a certainty, not a question. "They live paycheck to paycheck, drowning in credit card debt to maintain their lifestyle." "Precisely," David said. "And Frank knew that. Which brings us to the second part of the clause." He scrolled down the page. "If the buyout is not completed within the 90-day period, the joint tenancy is legally dissolved, and the property must be immediately listed for sale on the open market. The proceeds after the sale are to be split according to the 50-50 ownership." It was a masterpiece, a legal checkmate. Frank had given his daughter a stake in his legacy, but he had given his wife the power. He had ensured that my half of the home's value was not just an abstract number on a piece of paper, but a liquid asset I could access at any time. He had given me an escape hatch, a way to reclaim my life and my capital if my own home ever became a prison. So, Shirley said, leaning forward, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of the coming battle, what you're saying is, by giving her mother an ultimatum to leave, Danielle has actually just started the clock on her own eviction? That's exactly what I'm saying, David confirmed. He turned to me, his expression now gentle. Beverly, the choice is yours. We can send them a letter of warning, try to negotiate a more reasonable living arrangement, or we can trigger the clause. The power is entirely in your hands. I looked out the window at the Atlanta skyline, a city built of concrete and steel, of dreams and hard work. I thought of my beautiful home, of the love and labor Frank and I had poured into it. And I thought of my daughter, of her cold, entitled cruelty. The time for warnings was over. The time for consequences had begun. Draft the notice, David, I said, my voice as solid and unshakable as the foundation of the house I was about to reclaim. The 90-day time bomb starts now. The formal notice was delivered by a stern-faced courier the following Friday afternoon. I imagined the scene with a grim satisfaction. Danielle, perhaps in the middle of staging a photo of Jacob for her Instagram feed, the perfect mother in her perfect house, interrupted by the doorbell. I pictured her signing for the thick, legal-sized envelope, her curiosity turning to confusion, and then to a cold, sickening dread as she read the precise, unforgiving language of the law. The letter, as drafted by David, was a masterpiece of professional detachment. It did not speak of ultimatums or hurt feelings. It spoke only of legal obligations and contractual triggers. It formally notified Danielle Carter, as the remaining tenant of the property at 123 Abernathy Road, that the co-tenant Beverly Jordan had permanently vacated the residence. Pursuant to the terms of the Franklin B. Jordan Revocable Trust, the buyout clause was hereby activated. It went on to state that a professional appraisal of the property had been scheduled, and that she would have 90 calendar days from the date of the notice to secure financing and purchase Beverly Jordan's 50% share. It concluded with the cold, hard finality of the consequences. Failure to do so would result in the immediate and mandatory listing of the property for public sale. The fallout was instantaneous. My phone, which had been silent for the 5 days since I had left, lit up with a frantic, furious series of calls and texts. First came the rage. Danielle called me, screaming, her voice a shrill, ugly torrent of accusations. I was a monster. I was cruel. How could I do this to my own family? I didn't answer. I let the calls go to voicemail, each message a recording of a spoiled child realizing for the first time that her actions had consequences. Then came Greg's attempt at smooth-talking negotiation. He called, his voice a mask of calm reason, trying to appeal to my better nature. He spoke of misunderstandings, of things said in the heat of the moment. He suggested we all sit down and talk this out, as if this were a simple disagreement that could be solved over coffee. He was a salesman trying to close a deal, utterly failing to grasp that the product, my trust and respect, was no longer on the market. I didn't answer his calls either. The clock was ticking, a relentless 90-day countdown to their financial reckoning. The house on Abernathy Road, the symbol of their social status, the stage for their perfect life, had transformed overnight. It was no longer their castle. It was their prison, its beautiful brick walls closing in on them with each passing day. The very thing they had tried to steal from me, my home, was now the instrument of their downfall. Their arrogance had been built on the belief that they held an unbreakable claim to the property. They had never imagined that their greatest asset was actually their greatest liability. The time bomb was ticking, and the sound I imagined was deafening. The 90-day period was a slow, agonizing descent into reality for Danielle and Greg. The initial fury and disbelief gave way to a frantic, desperate scramble to defy the inevitable. They hired a lawyer of their own, a flashy downtown attorney whose bravado, I'm sure, was as expensive as it was ineffective. He sent a series of blustering letters to David, challenging the legality of the trust, questioning the validity of the clause, threatening countersuits. David responded to each with a calm, surgical precision, citing case law and precedent, dismantling their arguments one by one. The trust, he assured me, was an iron fortress. Frank had built it to last. Their legal challenges were a smokescreen for their real, far more pressing problem: the money. The official appraisal came in valuing the house at a number that made them gasp. Cascade Heights real estate was booming, and the beautiful, well-maintained home Frank and I had bought for a song decades ago was now worth a small fortune. My 50% share was a figure so far beyond their comprehension, let alone their means, that it might as well have been $1 billion. We know through the quiet, efficient channels of David's law firm that they embarked on a humiliating tour of Atlanta's banks and mortgage brokers. Their carefully curated image of wealth and success crumbled under the cold, hard scrutiny of a loan application. Lenders took one look at their financial reality and saw not a power couple, but a pair of reckless spenders living on a mountain of debt. They had a luxury car lease they couldn't afford, credit card statements that read like a novel, and a savings account that was practically non-existent. They had been living a life funded by my generosity and their own foolish pride, and now the bill had come due. They were denied again and again. The pressure began to eat away at the foundations of their own marriage. Shirley, my ever-reliable source of neighborhood intelligence, would give me updates. The shouting matches became a regular occurrence, their angry voices carrying through the open windows on warm evenings. Their friends, the other influencer moms and ambitious young professionals, began to distance themselves. The public spectacle of a family at war, of a for sale sign looming in their future, was a stain on the perfect image they had tried so hard to project. The house itself, once a source of pride, became a constant, mocking reminder of their failure. The beautiful garden I had so lovingly tended began to look neglected. The pristine rooms, once filled with the scent of my home cooking, now probably smelled of takeout boxes and stale anxiety. They were trapped in a gilded cage of their own making, the walls papered with their bad decisions. They had wanted the house without the mother, the asset without the responsibility. Now they were about to lose both. The house of cards they had built, propped up by my money and their own delusions, was collapsing in slow, agonizing motion, and they were buried somewhere in the wreckage. The knock on Shirley's door came on a Saturday afternoon, about 2 months into the 90-day period. I knew even before Shirley opened it who it would be. The anger had failed. The legal threats had failed. The smooth talking had failed. There was only one weapon left in Danielle's arsenal, and she had finally come to use it. When Shirley opened the door, Danielle was standing on the porch, not with fury in her eyes, but with a carefully orchestrated performance of brokenness. Her face was pale, her eyes were red-rimmed, and she was holding Jacob, my beautiful, innocent grandson, wrapped in a blue blanket, pressed against her chest like a shield. "I need to talk to my mother," she said, her voice a choked, tearful whisper. Shirley looked at me, her expression a mixture of pity and contempt for the transparently manipulative display. I nodded, my heart aching. I had been preparing for this moment. I knew it was coming. I stood up and walked to the door. "Let her in, Shirley," I said. Danielle walked into the living room, her movements slow and deliberate, every step designed to project an aura of maternal fragility. She didn't sit down. She stood in the middle of the room, clutching Jacob as if he were the only thing holding her up. The emotional climax of her drama had begun. "Mama, please," she sobbed, the tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. "I know we made a mistake. I know we were wrong. I'm not asking for myself. I'm not even asking for Greg." She looked down at the sleeping baby in her arms, her voice dropping to a desperate, pleading whisper. "I'm asking for him. For Jacob." She held the baby out slightly, a deliberate, heart-wrenching gesture. "Don't do this to him, Mama. Don't take his home away. This is the only home your grandchild has ever known. He deserves to grow up in his grandfather's house, surrounded by family. How can you do this? How can you put your own grandbaby out on the street? I'm begging you. For him." The performance was flawless. She was using the purest, most powerful love I had ever known as a tool to get what she wanted. She was counting on my grandmotherly heart to overrule my rational mind. It was a cruel, desperate, and deeply cynical move. And it almost worked. My heart fractured at the sight of that sweet, innocent child being used as a pawn in his parents' selfish game. I walked over to her, my steps slow and steady. I didn't look at her. I looked at Jacob, at his perfect, sleeping face. I reached out and gently stroked his soft cheek with the back of my finger. A wave of fierce, protective love washed over me, so powerful it was a physical force. And it was that love, that pure, unadulterated love for my grandson, that gave me the strength to do what I had to do. I looked up from the baby and met my daughter's tear-filled, manipulative eyes. My voice when I spoke was not angry. It was filled with a deep, profound, and heartbreaking sadness. I love my grandchild more than life itself, Danielle, I said, my voice quiet but unshakable. And it is precisely because I love him that I am doing this. You are using that sweet, innocent child as a shield to hide from the consequences of your own choices. You are wrapping your own greed in his baby blanket. I saw a flicker of shame in her eyes, but the desperation was stronger. That's not true, she whispered. I'm thinking of him. Were you thinking of him when you gave me your ultimatum? I asked, my voice still quiet but with an edge of steel. When you told me to be your nanny or get out of my own home, were you thinking of what was best for Jacob? Or were you thinking of what was easiest for you? A child's well-being is not just about the house he lives in, Danielle. It's about the values he is taught. He will not be raised in a home built on a foundation of entitlement and disrespect. The greatest gift I can give my grandson is parents who understand the meaning of responsibility and gratitude. And that, my dear, is a lesson you are now finally going to learn. I held her gaze, my own eyes clear and dry. The tears, the begging, the presence of the baby. It was a powerful emotional assault, but my resolve was a fortress. I would not be moved. I will never let my grandchild be on the street, I said, my voice softening with a final, solemn promise. I will make sure he always has a clean, safe roof over his head. But it will not be this roof. This roof comes with a price you have proven you are not willing to pay. I stepped back, my decision made, my position clear. The final, desperate plea had failed. The lesson would proceed as scheduled. The 90 days expired on a crisp, clear autumn day. The leaves on the dogwood trees lining Abernathy Road had turned a brilliant, fiery red, a final, beautiful burst of color before the long, cold winter. For Danielle and Greg, the winter had come early. Their frantic efforts had produced nothing. No bank would touch them. No family friend was willing to lend them a sum that large. Their time was up. The hammer fell not with a loud, dramatic crash, but with the quiet, inexorable turning of legal gears. David Chin filed the petition to force the sale of the property. The next morning, a realtor from a high-end Atlanta firm, a woman I had personally selected for her discretion and efficiency, arrived at the house. She walked through the rooms, her face a mask of professional neutrality, making notes on a clipboard. Danielle and Greg, I was told, followed her from room to room like ghosts, their faces pale and drawn. They were no longer the proud owners. They were simply the current temporary occupants of a property that was about to go on the market. The most public, most humiliating moment came a few days later. A work truck pulled up to the curb and a man in overalls got out. He carried a wooden post and a large rectangular sign. He walked onto the pristine manicured lawn, the lawn I had tended for 40 years, and with a few sharp percussive blows of a mallet, he hammered the sign into the earth. For sale. The sign was a public declaration of their failure. It was a symbol visible to every neighbor, every passerby, every one of Danielle's social media rivals, that the perfect life they had curated was a sham. The beautiful brick house in Cascade Heights was no longer their castle. It was just another piece of real estate, a commodity to be bought and sold. Shirley called me the moment the sign went up. "The eagle has landed," she had said, her voice a mixture of grim satisfaction and genuine sympathy. The process moved quickly. The house was desirable, and in the hot Atlanta market it was a prize. There were showings, open houses, a steady stream of strangers walking through the rooms that held the entire history of my adult life. I did not attend any of them. I did not need to. I was letting go of the bricks and mortar, of the physical structure. The memories, the love, the legacy of what Frank and I had built within those walls. Those were mine to keep, and they could not be sold. While the house was on the market, while Danielle and Greg were living in a state of suspended, anxious animation, I was not idle. I was not celebrating. I was preparing for the final phase of my plan. My actions had never been about leaving my family destitute. They had been about dismantling a false reality and forcing a confrontation with the truth. And now, with the lesson delivered and the consequences in motion, it was time to honor the promise I had made to my daughter on Shirley's porch, the promise I had made to myself in the quiet of my own heart. I would never let my grandchild be on the street. I began my own secret search. I was not looking for a grand house in an exclusive neighborhood. I was looking for a home, a real home, a place that was safe, clean, and most importantly affordable. I spent my afternoons driving through different neighborhoods, looking at two-bedroom apartments and small rental townhouses. I was looking for the kind of place Danielle and Greg could have afforded from the beginning, if they had been willing to live within their means, to save, to sacrifice, to build a life together instead of just curating an image of one. I finally found it in a quiet, family-friendly complex in Smyrna, a respectable suburb a few miles outside the city. It was a garden-style apartment with 2 bedrooms, a small but clean kitchen, and a little patio that overlooked a shared green space with a playground. It was modest. It was unassuming. It was in every way the polar opposite of the grand, stately home in Cascade Heights. It was perfect. I met with the property manager, a kind, no-nonsense woman who reminded me a little of myself. I explained the situation in vague general terms, that I was helping my children who were going through a difficult transition get back on their feet. I filled out the application myself. I paid the security deposit. And then I wrote a check from my own personal account for the first 6 months of rent. I was not giving them a handout that would enable their old lifestyle. I was providing them with a safety net, a stable foundation from which they could begin the hard work of building a new, more honest life. It was an act of grace, a final, unseen gesture of a mother's love, a love that was strong enough to deliver a hard lesson, but deep enough to provide a soft landing. The safety net was in place. All that was left was for them to fall. The offer on the house came quickly, a strong all-cash offer from a young doctor and his family who had fallen in love with the neighborhood. The closing was scheduled for the end of the month. The final act of the drama was about to take place. David Chin arranged for the signing to happen at his office, a neutral territory where the final, painful transaction could be completed with a minimum of emotion and a maximum of legal formality. I arrived first with Shirley by my side. I was calm, my heart at peace. I was not selling a house. I was closing a chapter of my life and beginning a new one. Danielle and Greg arrived a few minutes later. They looked like strangers. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed exhaustion. They were thinner, paler, the stress of the past 3 months having taken a visible toll. They did not look at me. They sat down at the opposite end of the long, polished conference table and stared at the stack of documents in front of them. The signing was a quiet, somber affair. The only sounds were the rustling of paper and the scratching of pens. We were dismantling a lifetime of shared history, reducing it to a series of signatures on legal forms. When it was over, the title company representative handed each of us an envelope. Inside mine was a check for my 50% share of the proceeds, a substantial sum that represented a lifetime of wise investment and hard work. Inside theirs was a much smaller check, their own share, significantly diminished by the legal fees they had incurred and the various debts that had been attached as liens against the property. It was a meager sum, not nearly enough for a down payment on another house. A stark, numerical representation of their failure. Danielle stared at the check in her hand, her expression blank. This was it. The end of the line. The moment she had been dreading for 90 days. She thought this was the final act, the moment of her ultimate defeat. He was wrong. David cleared his throat. "There is one last item of business," he said, his voice gentle. He slid a large, plain manila envelope across the table towards them. "This is from your mother." Danielle looked up, her eyes full of a weary confusion. She slowly reached for the envelope, her fingers trembling slightly. She opened the flap and pulled out the contents. First, there was a set of keys attached to a simple plastic fob with an apartment number on it. Beneath the keys was a signed lease agreement for the 2-bedroom apartment in Smyrna. And at the very bottom was a single sheet of my personal stationery, on which I had written a short, final note. She read the note aloud, her voice a raw, broken whisper. "This is for my grandchild. It is a clean, safe roof over his head, not a foundation for the lifestyle you chose. It is the last handout you will ever receive from me. The rest is up to you. Mom." The room was utterly silent. Danielle stared at the note, at the keys, at the lease. She looked up, her eyes finally meeting mine across the vast, polished expanse of the table. And for the first time in a very long time, I did not see entitlement or anger or manipulation. I saw a flicker of something else, something I had not seen since she was a little girl who had fallen and scraped her knee. I saw a glimmer of raw, genuine, and devastating understanding. The lesson, in all its painful, heartbreaking clarity, had finally been received. 6 months later, I was sitting on the balcony of my new condominium in Midtown, a sleek, modern space with a panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline. It was smaller than the house on Abernathy Road, but it was all mine, a space defined not by the past but by the future. My life was my own again. I had joined a yoga class, I was volunteering at the High Museum of Art, and I was planning a trip to Italy, a trip Frank and I had always dreamed of taking. I was not just surviving, I was thriving. My relationship with my grandson Jacob was the anchor of my new life. I saw him twice a week on my terms. I would pick him up and we would have our own adventures. We went to the zoo, to the children's museum, to the park. I was not his nanny, I was his grandmother. Our time together was not a duty. It was a joy, a pure, uncomplicated love, untainted by the drama and entitlement of his parents. Danielle and Greg were living in the apartment in Smyrna. The social media fantasy was dead. Danielle's Instagram feed was no longer a highlight reel of a fake, glamorous life. It was mostly silent, punctuated by the occasional unadorned photo of Jacob. She had taken a part-time remote job in marketing, her income now a necessary contribution to the family budget. Greg was still selling real estate, but the pressure of their new financial reality had forced a new humility upon him. They were struggling. They were paying their own bills, living within their means, learning the hard, unglamorous lessons of adult responsibility. I did not know what the future held for my relationship with my daughter. The wound between us was deep and it would take a long time to heal if it ever healed at all. But the lines of communication were slowly, tentatively reopening. She would call not to demand but to ask for advice, on a recipe on how to handle Jacob's latest cold. They were small, fragile bridges being built across a vast canyon of hurt. One afternoon she called me. "I was at the grocery store today," she said, her voice quiet, "and I saw they had your favorite kind of tea on sale. So I bought you a box." It was a small gesture, almost insignificant. But it was the first time in years she had thought of my needs before her own. It was not a full apology, not a complete absolution of her sins. But it was a start. It was a seed of hope, planted in the hard, barren ground of a lesson learned. I had made my daughter homeless not by an act of cruelty but by an act of love. A tough, painful love that had forced her out of a house she didn't deserve so that she could one day finally learn how to build a home she had earned.